This Lent, we're exploring who killed Jesus.
Many people are convinced that they know the answer.
But we've gathered 16 suspects as we retrace the events of Holy Week in the special 6-week podcast.
With your help, we'll discover who really killed Jesus.
This podcast is a production of progressivechristianity.org
and University Christian Church, San Diego.
I'm Caleb Lines.
And I'm Marshela Salgado.
This is Who Killed Jesus? A True Crime Podcast, Episode 2, Holy Monday. Welcome to the Who Killed Jesus True Crime Podcast, Episode 2, Holy Monday, where we are walking through the events of Holy Week, trying to decide who exactly killed Jesus. So last week we talked about Palm Sunday, and we walked through the events of that day as we saw on one side of town Pontius Pilate coming in with this great display of Roman force, and on the other side of town we saw Jesus coming in with his crew of peasants waving their palm branches in an anti-imperial planned demonstration. I think one thing that's important to note about Palm Sunday is that it's very much about empire and Jesus' anti-imperialism. And it's also something that didn't just happen one time, but happens all the time, that every day is Palm Sunday, that each day we get to make a choice about whether we join the parades of power and imperialism, the Roman parade, or whether we join the Jesus March, the parade of anti-imperialism, of peace through justice. So I think without this understanding, we can't really properly understand why Holy Week began the way that it began. So that's what we talked a little bit about last time. And Marshela, we also developed the list of suspects.
Yes. Well, we asked the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as one does.
Well, we asked people on social media who they thought some of the suspects might be, and we did get quite a good list. We'll touch on them really quickly, but if you want to hear more, you can go back to episode 1 where we delve into it a little bit more. But we have, first of all, the Roman Empire. We have Pilate, the Sanhedrin, Jews, Sadducees, Pharisees, original sin, God, one of my favorites, Republican Party, and you threw in also just U.S. politics in general. Right. My personal sin, not just Marshela, but your personal sin as well.
Mine? What?
I know. So our personal sin,
okay.
My other favorite, Courtney Love. Courtney did it. Judas, greed, disciples, Caiaphas, and the Roman Empire. So those were the suspects that were thrown out initially. I hear you might have a few new ones that people added.
Oh, that's true. Yes. After last week, some folks added some other suspects. And so we kind of started to narrow it down last week a little bit. We talked about the Roman Empire.
Roman Empire and, well, Pilate.
Pilate, of course.
Emerged as a suspect. And then the one that really that hit me was Caiaphas, not somebody that I had really, I don't go around thinking about Caiaphas every day.
Why not?
But I know, very obscure person in the Bible. But Caiaphas emerged also. So those were, I think, the top 3.
We talked about the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor Tiberius a little bit too, but I think you're right that those are the top 3. And someone suggested, okay, but what about Herod Antipas? So Herod Antipas was the Roman tetrarch, or the tetrarch of the Jewish people, and he was controlling a portion of the land where Jesus was, including Galilee. And so this was not Herod, who we find in the birth narratives. That's Herod the Great. It's his son. And after Herod the Great stopped ruling, Herod Antipas got a portion of that kingdom. And he wasn't really King Herod. He was a tetrarch, but he did have some power. And at least one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke, talks about a possible role in Jesus's death. And certainly Herod Antipas is responsible for the beheading of John the Baptist, because John the Baptist criticized his marriage.
Yeah. Whoever threw that out knows their Bible facts.
That's
I
right.
just have to say.
That's right. So that was a great one. I like that. We should probably add Herod Antipas to our murder board. He is
Nice.
listed in one of the Gospels as participating in Jesus's crucifixion.
Okay.
And two other responses I got were no one killed Jesus
No one killed Jesus. What? I don't. I guess I don't get it.
because he
Like,
died. And so the thought was no one killed Jesus because he's still alive, because his presence,
I
his spirit is still with us.
I like that.
Okay.
I like
You like
that.
that?
I mean, yeah. I mean, it depends on which way you look at it, but that is very creative.
Right. And not historical,
Right.
but a theological statement.
Mm-hmm.
And so another one was human frailty killed
Okay.
Jesus.
Okay.
That it was because humans didn't have the wherewithal to stand up on behalf of Jesus. They were complicit in it, so human
Okay.
frailty. So those were
Okay.
two other responses, two other suspects we got in addition to Herod Antipas. So
Okay.
we've got a good list of suspects, Marshela. That's
We
a
do.
lot, especially when a lot of people will just name one and they'll say it
Right.
as if they're very convinced of that they possess the whole truth about it all. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you have any favorite suspects of any of the ones we've talked about so far?
Well, yeah,
Courtney Love.
Courtney Love. Courtney Love
Yeah.
will always be my favorite. Yes.
Yeah.
But
And how do you think she did it?
and how? Yeah, I don't know.
Was it the cross? Was she working behind the scenes? How did she do it?
She did it with a note, and I don't know. No. I do like the Courtney. I mean, that's just to keep my own conspiracy theories going strong. No, but really, the Roman Empire. I mean, because that's what I fall back on. But with 16 suspects, I think there's. I don't know. It's hard to choose from. There's a few
Okay.
that have popped up that
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about. I
Yeah.
hadn't considered. But I think the Roman Empire is one,
Mhm.
and I'm curious to know more. I think Caiaphas stirred up some ideas in my brain about just the Jewish like hierarchy, like who the Jewish leaders
Mhm.
and their collusion and they're working with Rome. Like, what is that, or is that really how it worked, or I don't know. So it just left me with questions. But I'm curious. So I think the Roman Empire and Caiaphas. How about you?
The Roman Empire and Caiaphas. You know, one thing that I think I'm leaning towards multiple suspects. Like
Mm.
it's like an Agatha Christie novel, you know, where you think there's
Yes.
one person who's going to be
Mhm.
responsible, and as it turns out, it's a whole bunch of them
Right.
secretly
Right.
colluding together. And
Mhm.
one thing that, as we are reading Borg and Crossan's book the last week, that I am reminded of is that there were a whole lot of forces working against Jesus, and
Yeah.
it's not real surprising that he ended up on that cross.
Yeah.
So I think I'm
Indeed.
leaning towards more suspects than I thought about when
Nice.
I entered. And so
Mhm.
I think that's one of the things that's really good about reading these stories over and over again
Yeah.
and reading historians and scholars, theologians talking about this,
Mhm.
is that no matter how much we think we know about it, that there's always more to learn.
Yeah.
And we're 2,000 years removed from this. And
Mhm.
people probably didn't know all the details even then.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so coming back all these years later, I think there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Palm Sunday and some of the suspects that have arisen so far, but
Mhm.
we're moving throughout the week. And one of the things we're doing in this podcast is retracing Jesus's last week day by day. And
Mhm.
so we're moving on to Monday because in the Gospel of Mark, Mark sets the week out one
Mhm.
day at a time, and he tells us what happens each day of the week. And so
Right.
Monday is the temple cleansing, as it's often called, or the temple
The
tantrum.
temple tantrum. Like
You like that?
that image, the meme of Jesus just, throwing the table and it flying and, just words flying out of his mouth in anger.
The whips.
Yes, and
Achha!
the whips. Yep. Yes, Indiana Jones, Jesus.
Oh, I like that. Indiana Jones Jesus.
There you
He
go.
doesn't even have to search for the Holy Grail. He
No,
knows
he
where it
knows
is.
exactly.
He just used it the night before.
I like that.
And I like that meme that says, if anyone ever asks you what would Jesus do, remind them that losing your temper and turning over tables is always an option.
Yes, I do like that one. Yeah. The temple tantrum. Yeah. But um I mean, what did you grow up thinking
Uh,
happened there? Or like what were
mhm.
you told? What were your
Well, first of all, I don't think I ever thought much about it being during Holy Week.
Okay,
It
yeah.
was just because we didn't ever talk about it.
Mhm.
We talked about Palm Sunday, and as we talked about last week, we might hop into church for a Maundy Thursday and
Mhm.
then come back for Easter or something like that. But we didn't celebrate Monday in any way, and in the same way that most churches don't.
Mhm.
And so I think I just thought that this was a part of one of the things that he did. I don't
Mhm.
think I realized the linear progression of Jesus's ministry in
Mhm.
which he was headed to Jerusalem. Because if you
Mhm.
read through the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, then Jesus is only in Jerusalem one time, and it's
Mhm.
this time.
Right.
Other than, if you read in the Gospel of Luke when he was a kid and he went into the temple for the
Right.
dedication stuff, but that's only in one gospel. In the Gospel of John, he goes to Jerusalem 3 times, and so
Mhm.
it's a little different. But I don't think I really realized that it was a part of what was going on in Holy Week. So I didn't
Yeah.
realize it was a part of the conversation at all, and I'm like, "Oh, they just made Jesus really mad." Jesus really
Right.
lost at that time.
Right. Right. You make a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Even in reading it, I was
Mhm.
like, last week I joked, I'm like, did anything even happen on Monday? Because again,
Yeah.
we go from Sunday to maybe Thursday, but, you go from Palm Sunday to Easter
Mhm.
Sunday and everything's good. You make a really good point. I never thought about it within the context of Holy Week, that it was something that
Oh, yeah.
happened during Holy Week. And just right now when you're talking, it kind of set a little light off in my head that's like, oh, that makes the event almost even more important.
Mhm.
And now having had read the chapter, like it really shifts, again, like or not shifts, but re-emphasizes this point that there was purpose in that week in Jerusalem.
Mm.
And then you made another point that I never really thought about is we don't talk. I mean, we don't. Growing up, I thought that Jesus spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. It's like,
Mhm.
that's his hangout spot,
Right, yeah.
right? Like,
It's like
we
going to the mall.
yeah, exactly. It's
Go to the
like, "Where are
temple.
you going
Yeah.
today?"
Or
"Jerusalem,
we're dating
the
ourselves,
temple,
people hanging
the
out at the
mall, the
mall,
mall." I know.
you know?
Exactly. And my kid would be like, "Where?"
"Let's go to the mall."
Oh, no. But I mean, again, like this adds to the
Mhm.
significance of the week,
Yeah.
of the location of Jerusalem in general. And now that you're saying that Jesus, didn't hang out there all the time, just the events of the week seem that much more important. And this event at the temple has always been important in my brain, but
Yeah.
in the context of Holy Week makes it, I think, elevates it a little bit more.
I also think I thought that whenever Jesus went and overturned the money changer table, that, like, everyone thought, "Okay, well, you shouldn't be taking money in church, in a religious
Hmm.
institution," right?
Hmm.
That they were exploiting people or something, trying to take their
Right.
money, and I don't that's not really what it was at all, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, and I also pictured, I think, just, like, a couple of tables in, like, a church lobby.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
like that was my
Yes.
experience of religious institutions, right? And
Yeah.
so I grew up in this rural church, and we had a little lobby as you were entering, and there was, like, a table there,
Mhm.
and so that was my mental image, was somebody just sitting out there at
Yeah.
a table and Jesus just turning it over, which also wasn't really very accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think those are the images that we were told and kind of
Mhm.
given. I mean, I'm sure I feel like there was a sermon or something in there, or at least storytelling
Yeah.
about what happened in the temple. And so that was the kind of the narrative I was given. Like people were selling things there, and Jesus didn't like that they were taking
Mm.
advantage of people or selling, or
Yeah.
even that they were selling little animals for sacrifice. He
Right.
didn't like that, so
Because he was the
because
sacrifice.
yes,
That's
because he was the
the sermon
ultimate
we get. Yeah.
exactly. So that really I think, I mean, I knew this and I studied this at one point, but
Yeah.
again, like it's easy to fall back on ideas that I grew up with
Yeah.
sometimes more than what I've learned is historically accurate
Yeah.
or even prophetically accurate,
Yeah.
like this combination of, prophecy and history and just like Jesus knew what he was doing. I didn't get that story though. I got a very different like just what was happening. The narrative doesn't fit with what I'm learning here, but
Yeah. I think that's important, Marcella, is, we call that embedded theology, the
mhm.
theology that we learn when we're young. And sometimes, no matter how hard we work to get rid of that,
Mhm.
it can stay with us for a long time,
Oh,
and it's hard to dismantle.
yeah.
So there's a lot to talk about when we're thinking about Holy Monday and Jesus going into the temple. So let's take just a quick break and get into more of the details.
Who Killed Jesus? A true crime podcast is a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast is brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church, San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, a True Crime podcast, where we're exploring who might have really killed Jesus, and we're talking about the temple incident on Holy Monday. So it's often described as a temple tantrum, but Borg and Crossan say that it should probably more likely be described as an indictment of the temple because of what is happening in the
Yes,
temple. Do you like that phrase,
I
the temple
do.
indictment?
Yes, and it because it changes. Again, it just changes the story. It changes
Uh,
um the intention of the
mhm.
moment. It wasn't just Jesus walking in and I'm angry that you're doing, all those things that
Losing
are
it
made.
without any prepreparation, he just sees it and he loses
Yes.
his temper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But early on in the chapter, when they talk about Palm Sunday, and
Mhm.
then maybe it's later in the chapter. I don't remember at what point. I think it was maybe later in the no, whenever. They talk about this being, like these two events can be seen as one big event. So
Mhm.
Palm Sunday and what happens in the temple, or it can be seen as two different events, but with the same intent, the
Mhm.
same purpose. So it really does change it for me. But I do have to say, Caleb,
Yeah.
this was a lot to take in.
It
This
was a
whole
lot.
chapter was
There was a lot here.
it was I had to read it and listen to it twice
Yeah.
to try to take it all in. So
Yeah.
you're going to have to walk me through some of this because there was a lot of that I needed clarification on.
It's complicated, right? And Borg and Crossan point that out. They say, in fact, that Mark's narrative was so confusing that Matthew changed it.
Mhm.
Because Matthew, when Matthew came along using Mark, Matthew and Luke both used Mark as their main source for their gospel, that Matthew didn't put the temple indictment on
Uh-huh.
Monday, but put it on Sunday instead.
Mhm.
So I think one thing that's important to realize is exactly what you just said, that Palm Sunday was a planned anti-imperial political demonstration. And the temple indictment was
Mhm.
not just Jesus going in and losing his temper because he was mad in the moment, but it was also a planned protest, but this time against the temple leaders. And I
Mhm.
think that's something that's really important for us to realize is that Jesus really took issue both with the imperialism of Rome
Mhm.
and with the way that religion was practiced by the
Right.
authorities. And I think that's important to say because if you read through, say, the Gospel of John, especially when we get to this point in the story, we find a lot of generalizations.
Mhm.
And that's because of the context in which John was written. And we'll get more into that later. But John loses the differentiation between different groups
Okay.
and puts all the Jews together. And that's why the Gospel of John can be interpreted in anti-Semitic ways,
Right.
because he
Uh-huh.
loses the differentiation
Uh-huh.
between the different groups.
Mm.
So I like the thought of the temple being a planned protest against the religious establishment. What do you think
Mhm.
of that idea?
I really like it. I like how they touch on that in
Mhm.
the book, especially. Because again, looking at the list of suspects,
Yeah.
it's thrown out there, and this is where we get a lot of the anti-Semitism, also like the Christian anti-Semitism, is the Jews. The
Mhm.
Jews were the ones that crucified Jesus, paying no attention to any structures of leadership that they might have had, and also kind of ignoring just the social structures and hierarchy. And like a lot of the Jewish community weren't rich, like they were
Yeah.
the peasants that hung out and followed Jesus, people
Right.
who were oppressed and marginalized. um but that doesn't mean that they had, like they followed rules because they were told to follow rules, right? But
Yeah.
who was making up these rules, who was making sure that they didn't revolt and that they were always falling in line with the Roman Empire,
Mm, mhm.
the Jewish leaders. So
Yeah.
they explain some of that in the book, and I
Yes.
I like that a lot because again, that changes things. In It's not the Jews as one big group, but then we're
Right.
looking at Jesus took issue not with his faith and not with
Yeah.
his tradition, but with how people were abusing it, and those people being the leaders, the Jewish leaders.
That's a really important distinction, especially when we remember that Jesus was Jewish.
Right.
From the day he was born till the day he died, he was Jewish. He never thought that he was starting a new religion, and
Mhm.
likely his followers didn't think that either because they were also Jewish, the ones who followed him the closest. So, one of the points that goes along with what you were speaking about is that there was this rigid notion of purity in the
Mhm.
ancient world. And Borg and Crossan don't talk about it a lot in the last week, but I think it's really important, and they talk about it in other writings, and that's that there was this rigid system of purity.
Mhm.
And if you came into contact with certain groups of people, you yourself became ritually impure. And it meant that you could not practice your religion. You couldn't go into the temple. And so if you came into contact with people who had skin diseases, the Bible
Mhm.
calls it leprosy, but it's not Hansen's disease in the way that we think about it today. It was just any number of skin conditions. Came into contact with a woman who was menstruating.
Right.
If you came into contact with people who were poor, they were considered ritually
Mm.
unclean. And so that made you unclean. And
Mm.
if you didn't make sure that you were trying to make yourself pure again, you would become chronically impure.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so you had to go through this very elaborate ritual. There were these ritual baths called mikvahs that
Mhm.
you would go in and bathe in and become physically and spiritually pure. Sound a lot like baptism, right?
Right.
Except, so that's one of the things that John the Baptist was talking about.
Right.
And so, you would go through this mikvah, and then you could go and you could practice your religion.
Question.
Yes.
Was this just for men or was it men and
It was
women?
men and women. So
Okay.
women, after they had had their period, would have to go through and get
Right.
ritually purified.
Okay.
But if men came into contact with those women while they
Mhm.
were menstruating, they became ritually impure. And
Okay.
so there was this whole notion that you would try and stay separate during that time for that reason. It's the same reason that you find people described in the Bible who are sick or who have a skin condition being
Mhm.
outcast from their community. It was because if you came into contact with them, you couldn't practice your religion. And
Right.
so I think this is one of the things that's going on both with the temple indictment
Mhm.
and with this weird thing that happens with the fig tree.
Okay. Yes, the fig tree.
The fig tree.
Can you
Yes.
explain that a little bit? Because again,
Mhm.
this is temper tantrum Jesus.
Uh-huh.
I
I
like
hate you, fig tree.
you just and well, in the book they even mention like this all of this took place during March, April, during a time, what we now consider March, April, um, when the fig wouldn't have been producing fruit anyway. And he knew that.
Yeah.
Everybody around him knew that. And yet he expected the tree to produce fruit. And then he gets really mad, so that it's just like 2 tantrums in a row. Like, do you need to eat? Like, what do you need, Jesus? So explain this a little bit, please.
So before I can cross and say that this is a cue that we should take the story more symbolically, but I actually think there's maybe a little bit more to it than that. So the text says that Jesus comes along the fig tree and he sees it in leaf. Right? So from a distance, he sees it and it looks like it is producing fruit.
Okay.
But then he goes up to it and it isn't actually producing fruit. And so he condemns it, right? And the weird thing, you'll never produce fruit again.
He's so mean.
It's so mean, Jesus. So the fig tree isn't actually a fig tree. The fig tree is a religious establishment, right? Where it looks like it is producing fruit. It has all the exterior signs that it is producing fruit, but it's not. And so that's the indictment of the purity system that Jesus is giving. It has all the external signs that it is going to help you connect to God, has all the external signs of religiosity, and yet it's inauthentic. And yet it doesn't actually help people to connect with God. And so he talks over and over again about like the people who just stand up praying, who make a big show of their faith and yet don't actually have their faith. That's the indictment of the purity system that he's giving. And I don't know, Marshela, I bet if we put our minds to it, we might be able to draw some parallels between that and maybe the U.S. politics version of events today and on our murder board?
Yeah, I think so. I think it sounds vaguely familiar. Churches claiming a lot of stuff, but producing fruit, but not really producing fruit, and
false religiosity.
Yeah. I think so. I think that would be. I mean, again, well, first of all, I'm a little bit surprised. I'm like, are you saying this is simply symbolism? Are you saying this maybe didn't happen? It's a story that Mark wrote, because again, growing up, I was led to believe, once again, I need to clarify, not by my family, but by the church I went to, that all of these stories, like this is what happened. These are these aren't stories. These are like actual like historical documents of Jesus's life. But in reading the book and in talking to you and just, like obviously in my studies, but especially going back to the books, like these are symbols, these are stories.
Yes, and I would maybe draw a distinction here. I would say that all the stuff about the fig tree is symbolism. I think that there very likely was a temple demonstration. I don't think that it was likely to the degree that we often think about, but I think that there was at least a minor disturbance at the temple, some kind of a protest. It might have gone mostly unnoticed in the same way that the Palm Sunday parade went mostly unnoticed, because it was taking place in this place called the courtyard, the court of Gentiles. And it was this 24-acre outer court. So even if Jesus had all of his disciples involved, there wasn't really a way to shut that down.
Right. I did like that very much. And Borg and Crossan do mention like the Vietnam War, when some of the protesters would go in and, throw blood on draft papers or draft letters or but those symbolic acts. So, and people, as we're engaging in activism, a big question that sometimes I received like in my 20s when I was a lot more active too was like, what's the point of that? Why, like, you're not going to stop anything from happening. And the point is it's symbolic. Like we know that this isn't but maybe we'll get somebody's attention.
Yeah.
We're making a statement. We're making a statement against, the systems of power. And the fact that that's what he was doing, like he didn't shut the whole temple down. It's not like all of a sudden every single table was overturned and we can't do business today. Like we're closing the temple down. Thank you, Jesus. It really was more of a, for him, it was something that was important. And he was making a point, right? For the people who did notice. I liked that. I liked hearing that. And I liked activist Jesus,
I like that. That's much better than temper tantrum Jesus, activist Jesus. Yeah, I like that. And so they come out of the temple and then they see the fig tree has died. And that is also symbolic, right? They're probably wasn't this fig tree, but it's the author giving us narrative about this,
Mhm.
interpretation of this, that Jesus had then cast judgment on the temple authorities.
Mm.
And so a couple of
Right.
groups from our suspect list to lift up at this point, I think, are both the Pharisees, who really became strict about purity laws,
Mhm.
and the Sadducees, who were priests closely associated with the temple.
Mhm.
And so I think both of these people have a role in the things that we were just talking about. But there's another element that Borg and Crossan spend most of their chapter talking about, which is not just this purity system, because they don't go into that in the same detail that we just did, but
Mhm.
they talk about the collusion of the
Right.
temple leaders, in this case, Sadducees and high priest
Mhm.
Caiaphas, right, with the Roman Empire. And they talk about Jesus's phrase, a den of robbers.
I loved that. I
Mhm.
love so growing up again, this
Yeah.
my understanding of a den of robbers was you're sitting here in the temple, you're stealing money from these good people who just
Mhm.
want to, have do practice their religion, practice sacrifice, practice whatever, and you're selling things, like you're stealing from it. That's not what most likely was meant in a den of robbers.
Yeah.
So the way that they explain what a
Mhm.
den of robbers is, I loved it. Can you explain it? Because you explain so much better
So
than
it's
I
from
do.
Jeremiah, and there's a phrase also from Isaiah, and Borg and Crossan point out to the fact that probably it's more likely that the quote from Jeremiah, "Den of robbers" piece is more likely historical. And so the
Mhm.
den is a place where you go to hide away. And so
Yeah.
you've got these colluders with Rome who are oppressing their people, who are stealing their money,
Mhm.
right? Who are actively oppressing the people, who are hiding away in the temple, like a
Mhm.
den, like foxes in the den.
Mhm.
And in that case, Jesus is saying that people are using their religiosity to disguise what they're doing as they hide away. And
Right.
I think ultimately, when we get right down to it, that's what Holy Monday is about. It's
Mm.
about condemning false religiosity.
Right.
It's an indictment of the religious leaders. Again,
Mhm.
not Jews in general, the religious leaders of his day who were imposing purity system, who were hurting the people that they were supposed to be standing up for.
So again, Sadducees, Pharisees, but this reminds me again of US politics
Mhm.
and what's happening in a lot of churches where out on the outside, that's where the stealing, the hurting, the all this stuff that they're doing, and then you come to church on Sunday
Yeah.
and the den of robbers is filled, and, we're just patting each other on the back
Yeah.
and doing, like, that's your place of hiding. That's your place of just trying to pretend that you're not doing what you're doing.
Mm.
Um, I don't know, it really hit. It really
I think
that
you're right.
it hit, yeah.
The religious right in particular, right? That
Mhm.
they're gonna control women's bodies, that they're not going to welcome the stranger, that they're going to condemn, people who are at the border or people who are crossing the border because they have no choice, that they're going to condemn LGBTQIA+ plus people, that they are
Mhm.
not going to care for those who are the most in need, even though these are commands that are given over and over again in the Bible, that we're supposed to love our neighbor, that we're supposed to take care of the vulnerable, and yet they hide behind this religiosity. They
Right.
come to church where they can sing nice hymns with nice people and
Yeah.
only do that on Sunday morning and then lead the rest of their lives as if
Yeah.
they're not Jesus followers,
Yeah.
because they're not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that Holy Monday is all about condemning exactly that.
Wow, that was powerful. That is powerful, especially looking at it as day by day during Holy Week, but to know that once again, Jesus did it with intention. There was intention behind his act in the temple, and it's a very powerful statement. It's a very powerful statement, and it's so much more powerful than just thinking like, yeah, Jesus got angry. I can get angry too when things aren't right or when people are doing wrong. It was far more than that. Jesus, I mean, was calling his followers and himself to stand up to
Yes.
systems of oppression, which that right there, that purity system not only sounds oppressive, but
Yeah.
it's, to stand before somebody and God
Mhm.
with all these things that were most likely very difficult for peasants to live up to.
Yeah.
Like, how do you, as somebody who's sick, you're not allowed to be with other people. I mean, like all these standards are just really rough. So there is intention to it, and I like it
There
because
is an intention
it's
to it. It was
powerful.
planned. They were both planned, and I think that's important for understanding the events of Holy Week.
Mm.
So we've gone through Holy Monday today, and I think learned a lot and gotten some great suspects. Next week, we'll go through both Tuesday and Wednesday, the most forgotten about days, Marshella, and Holy
Nothing
Week.
happened. You can't convince me that anything happened.
We'll find out if that's really true or not next time on Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast.